Thanks, Sarah. I'm really excited to be here. I haven't been here before. I'm really lame. I'm old for a graduate student, and I have kids and stuff, and I'm never out with grown-ups at night like this. Usually I'm reading stories and getting ready for bed, so I feel really cool just being here with you, so thanks a lot. I want to share with you a little bit of a side project that I've had the opportunity to work on in my lab. It doesn't directly relate to my dissertation, but it's really important and it's really neat because it's something that's unfolding and that we're working on right here in Ohio. And it's about our search for an endangered bumblebee. Maybe you didn't realize that bees are allowed to be protected under the Endangered Species Act. They are, as of quite recently. But before I jump into bees, I want to talk a little bit about why we care so much about them and why we love them so much. And the main reason is because bees and other pollinators help plants have sex. So if you had to try to survive, get the food you need, the water you need, and reproduce without moving anywhere, you'd probably find it pretty difficult. We are able to walk around. You can try to pick somebody up here or wherever. I don't know how you do that. But if you're trying to do this as a plant, that's really, really tricky. And a long time ago, hundreds of millions of years ago, plants would just throw their pollen grains out into the wind and hope that these things would find the right target, produce seeds and fruits and things like that. And it didn't take long for pollinators to figure out that pollen was a really good source of protein, in case you didn't know that. And so pollinators started eating this stuff, and as they moved from flower to flower, they inadvertently helped the plants reproduce. And so I'm not going to try to pretend how to do the laser pointer on here because I forgot. Sorry, Sarah. But what you can see here in this really simple diagram, you have a butterfly that's touching the male reproductive part of a flower and then moving to another flower to get a drink of nectar, and it's touching a receptive female reproductive organ. You didn't realize this was going to be so adult, did you? And that will ultimately fertilize the ovules and produce seeds. So plants really depend on pollinators to sexually reproduce. And it changed, the estimates vary, but about 90% of flowering plants in the world today benefit from animal pollinators. And they're diversified and beautiful, and we love them. So we depend on plants for food, clothing. The furniture that a lot of you are sitting on is made out of products from plants. They cycle nutrients in the air and the gases that we breathe. Plants help make the world go round. And without them, you and I would be dead a long time ago. We depend on them greatly, and the pollinators help them to survive and be happy and wonderful. Now, there's a lot of different pollinator types in the world. The first pollinators that we know about were beetles. Flies are pollinators as they move from flower to flower, collecting stuff, even wasps. Of course, we all know of butterflies, and then some more interesting things that aren't insects, like birds and bats, can also pollinate flowers. So anything that's drinking nectar for a bee or something else, think of that like drinking some kind of an energy drink. It's packed with sugar. It gives them a lot of energy for flying around. So other animals want to get in on that. But the most important group of pollinators that there are in the world, I'll sit back so you can see, are the bees. They're absolutely the best at it. They're the hardest working. They depend on pollen and nectar for every phase of their reproduction and growth. So little eggs, larvae, all of that stuff, everything depends on flowers all of the time. So they've evolved to be the most efficient pollinators, and they're amazing. This is where I pause for an effect. For you to go, oh, somebody to go, holy, and get up and drop your drink or something. These images aren't altered at all. These are just fantastic images from Sam Droege at the USGS. And you have things like this right here in Ohio, like that metallic green sweat bee in the top right there. So these are incredible, and they have all different kinds of shapes and sizes. Some are as small as the tip of a ballpoint pen. Some are as large as the top half of your thumb. They're really, really incredible, and probably much more diverse than you think about. And one of the primary reasons we really care about them, in addition to everything else we said, is for the foods that we enjoy because of pollinators. So I was looking at some of this data today. As I mentioned before, for just flowering species worldwide, it's approximated about 90% of those benefit from pollinator services. And then when we talk just about agricultural food, we've got about 3/4 of the global food crops need or benefit from animal pollinators. So for just honeybees, which is not the focus of my talk, but everybody's usually familiar with European honeybee, that's estimated about $20 billion every year, USD, and $4 billion for native bees. And you'll have a better idea what I mean by native bees when I'm done in a little bit. In Ohio, specific things that we depend on, a lot of the cucurbits, squashes, pumpkins, and then wonderful things like apples and strawberries and raspberries. And there's something that really, really matters here, especially for agriculture, even in our state. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll say, yeah, I get it. We need them because the plants need them, and we all benefit from having healthy, diverse plant communities. So this is cool. I saw this on Reddit last week. This is a grocery store in Slovakia, and this wasn't like a shipping error. I dug a little deeper to make sure this wasn't. But they purposely opened a new location of a Tesco, and they left all the produce that depends on healthy pollinators for pollination to produce that stuff off of the shelves to try to show people like you and me just how much we depend on them every day for the things that we eat. Hopefully they got the message, and hopefully, more and more people are becoming aware of how important pollinators are and the services they provide. Which brings me to a big question. This is something that has been really, really popular and discussed a lot in the literature over the last 20 years is, are pollinators in decline? Is there a global pollinator crisis? I think a lot of people immediately think about what they understand about the European honeybee and colony collapse disorder. And there's really, really good data showing some of the challenges that have faced European honeybees and their domestication and being spread around the world, and things related to disease and mites and other such things. But we know a whole lot less about the other bees of the world. And so we're trying to figure that out, trying to understand of that 4 billion USD that we depend on in agriculture for wild native bees just flying around in Ohio and other places, what's going on and what are the trends? There are some things that we know are really, really struggling. And in temperate regions of the world, that's kind of a fancy way of basically saying the northern hemisphere, like the United States, Canada, and Europe, we've seen really strong declines in bumblebees and a few other native species. So answering this question of if there's a global pollinator crisis becomes really, really sort of a tricky thing. And it's even argued about in the literature. So there are people that say, yes, we have absolute concrete data that shows really strong declines of wild bees, particularly in some groups. And I'm going to show you one today, the rusty patch bumblebee. But there are other people that say, well, hey, just because we're seeing really strong declines in America and the UK doesn't mean necessarily this is going on in South America or wherever else around the world. So scientists are by nature really conservative, and in some ways that's really good because we don't want to make big statements beyond the data we have. But if we also wait to try to collect data on all the pollinators that there are in the world, we might lose a lot of them before we can actually do anything about it. And that's sort of the main point I want to make. And maybe you don't understand just how long that would take. This is rough approximations of bee diversity around the world. So we have about 500 species in Ohio. Woohoo! That's not the most diverse place even in North America. And in North America, we have about 5,000 total species, and then worldwide about 20,000, or somewhere in that range, more than 20,000. And I put, the little tilde there because these numbers are changing all the time as taxonomists and people identify things and declare new species, and phylogenies get rearranged and whatnot, but they're incredibly diverse. There's probably way more bees than you ever realized, I hope. That's one of the things I show you today. Even in a place like Ohio, 500 different species of just bee. So if we had to wait till we had data on all of them to say, okay, are their populations declining? What's happening here? This would take years. This would take a lot of money, and we might lose some of the species that we already see are threatened now if we had to wait. So I can't really answer that for you. Are we in a global pollinator crisis? Some people say, well, there's some really alarming trends that we're seeing, so we need to do something now. But there's other people that also say, well, yeah, we agree, there are problems. Let's try to fix those problems, but let's not, try to go into a full-blown 5-alarm panic until we have a little bit more data on the rest of the world. So Sorry, I'm not going to give you an answer. Like any good scientist, I'm just going to leave it open-ended. I'm here, and the data I'm going to share with you is about the rusty patch bumblebee. Now, this became proposed for protection under the Endangered Species Act late in 2016. The ball started rolling on this early 2017. And, you know, political stuff happens, and it took a little longer. But in the first half of 2017, the rusty patch bumblebee, Bombus affinis, became the first U.S. bumblebee protected under the Endangered Species Act, which is really sad because that means it's declined and it's threatened enough that we need to protect it. But I would also say, and maybe a fun conversation point for the evening, is to say what are the benefits of being on the endangered species list, and if it can get the ball rolling on some conservation efforts that maybe wouldn't otherwise happen. So this is a bumblebee. I'll talk about really quickly just the importance of bumblebees in general. These are like the teddy bears of the bee world. I love them. They're cuddly. You can hold them if you want. I don't totally recommend it. You can hold if you really, well, never mind. Somebody's going to get hurt. Forget I said anything. Don't touch them. But they're fuzzy and cute. The rusty patch bumblebee was really common until about 20 years ago. It's experienced about a 90% reduction across its range in the eastern U.S., and the cause of decline is still sort of a mystery. So it shares life history traits. That's a really fancy way of saying, like, it's things about its body size, where it nests, the timing of its reproduction, that kind of stuff. It shares a lot of that with another eastern species that we see thriving all over the eastern U.S. That's Bombus impatiens, a common eastern bumblebee. So they have the same tongue lengths, which means they're feeding on the same kind of flowers. It nests at the same time and in the same kind of places. So it's a little bit tricky for us when we say, here's one species that's thriving, and here's another one that we've seen this drastic reduction in 2 decades. What's going on? And that's something that our lab wanted to try to understand a little bit better. 2 things that we think really are playing a role are diseases and mites, which is kind of been a plague of the bee world over the last few decades. But we also want to know a little bit about habitat loss and restrictions and things like that. Bumblebees in general are extremely important. They're large-bodied, which is really cool because they can fly at temperatures and in weather conditions that other bees cannot. So insects are ectothermic. That means their temperature is controlled by what's going on outside. The temperature around them, bumblebees can actually raise their internal temperature above the ambient temperature outside, which is so cool. So they can fly in really cold temperatures. So not only are they cuddly and cute, they're kind of hardcore, because they're out there in the weather that other things can't fly in. They're also diet generalists. So many of them build really big colonies that last months at a time, which means they can't be really specified on a single flower species, because as we go from spring to midsummer to late summer, different flowers are blooming at different times. So they're not picky eaters, which means they're good for your garden. They're good for crops and other things like that because they're not picky. We can have them in pretty large numbers in these social colonies, and there's about 50 species in North America. And they have all different kinds of coloration and really beautiful stuff. They're also really important for pollinating some groups of plants, especially in the Solanaceae. These are things like peppers and tomatoes and things that need a really good sort of vibration to release the pollen from the flowers. So there's some things they pollinate just better than other bee species. My uncle in the state of Washington, where I grew up a few years ago, had to pollinate his tomatoes with a paintbrush. That sucks. You don't want to do it. So do what I say, and we can save the bees. So for 2 years, I was part of a really big project with a team working at the University of Akron and my advisor, Karen Goodell at Ohio State. And we wanted to say, okay, this thing has experienced extreme reductions in its range throughout the eastern United States. Is the rusty patch bumblebee in Ohio? So I wish we could have traveled all over the east, but we can do, I think it's a good message maybe to say we can do something where we are today and provide some information, and if somebody else can do it in Pennsylvania and somebody else in Michigan or wherever else, then we can all put this together and try to understand what's happening. So we spent 2 years looking for this thing all over the state and to try to see if it has been extirpated, that's a fancy word of removed, from the state of Ohio. And we did all different types of habitat. We went to parks and metro parks and state nature preserves, and we even went to all these little pollinator plots along the highway where you see like the please do not mow things at like the trucker stop. We went everywhere that we think we could possibly find this. And we were looking at the types of habitat, the flower types, all of that. And we knew there was a good chance we might not find the bee, so we also just said, heck with it. Let's monitor all the bumblebees and see what we find. And that's what I'm going to show you here is 2 years of a ridiculous amount of looking for bumblebees. And what do we have in Ohio? So we visited 228 meadows, we did 317 surveys, and we visited 63 of the 88 counties in the state. Again, you can see kind of some trends with major highways because this was funded through the Department of Transportation. So part of our project was to actually say how well are these pollinator plots on the highway supporting bee diversity and things like that. And we would get out, we would look for bumblebees, net them for a while, and then count the flowers, all that kind of stuff to see what's going on, classify the habitat. And we had a lot of undergraduate helpers that we have to thank for that. So we found 11 species over the 2 years. There's about 10 more that can be found in Ohio. But you can see that the rusty patch bumblebee is not on this list, which is sort of sad. But we did find some other neat things out. Hopefully some of these look familiar to you. Some of them are also just beautifully colored, so they're really, really neat. And then the three most common, or sort of by abundance, the things that we saw the most were that eastern bumblebee, Bombus impatiens that I mentioned, that's on the top left. That was by far the most abundant bee that we found. And then I know you won't remember these names, but I'm going to pretend that you care so much. Bombus impatiens, Bombus griseocollis, and Bombus bimaculatus were the three most abundant bees that we found. Those made up 92% of the nearly 25,000 bumblebees that we observed. And Bombus impatiens was close to 50%. So about 25,000 observations is what we saw. And what we're thinking from here is that the rusty patch bumblebee, Bombus affinis, is probably no longer in the state of Ohio. However, we did find two other really rare bee species that are sort of on the watch list, Bombus borealis and sandersoni, which is really neat because you don't have to read all of these notes, but we observed a worker last year, and the last known record for that was in the 1950s. So we were pretty stoked that we found it. And then for the sandersoni, there hadn't been a good record since 2010. So we were pretty excited to see some bees that aren't normally seen. Now, I showed you the diversity. We found 11 species. Here's by abundance. So as I said, those three really common species that you'll see flying around all over the place represented 92% of the about 25,000 bees that we observed and looked at. So that's another thing, just a sort of a caveat for talking about this pollinator crisis, is we're saying in 25,000 observed bees, we couldn't find one individual of an endangered species. But, 50%, around 13,000 bees were Bombus impatiens. And I said these have very similar life history traits, similar in terms of diet, where they nest, their tongue length, things like that. And so it presents a little bit of a puzzle to say, why is one of these thriving in Ohio where the other one we think has been completely removed? So if the rusty patch bumblebee is in Ohio, there's fewer than 1 in 25,000. We feel really confident about that. Some species that are declining in other states, we found hundreds of those individuals here, like Bombus vagans and Furvitus, and I have those down here. Furvitus, this is a Furvitus queen on the left, and I love this. This is probably my most favorite bee because it's like almost solid golden colored along the abdomen. You can see along the back there. So she's just a beautiful queen right there. And we also saw a few other species that we weren't expecting to find in Ohio. I'm going to talk to you really quick about habitat, and this is where you can maybe think about, I want to do something to help the bees in my yard, or my neighbor's got a garden, or whatever. So we also classified the habitat where we found these things, and we saw some interesting patterns. Hayfields planted with red clover and alfalfa always had the highest abundance and diversity of bees. And sites planted with native wildflowers usually had more than 4 species. And this is a look at 2 different things. So here on the left, you have the meadow planted with some clover mix, and on the right is actually one of those roadside wildflower patches. So my hope is that you're looking at that and go, damn, I want my yard to look like that. And I'd say, that's a roadside patch. The government did that. Whoa. And you can do that in your yard with a wildflower mix, and it'll take care of itself, right? Those things are hardy and competitive. They'll survive well in Ohio. You could do that. Buy that mix and do that. Okay, so here's looking at things by habitat. The bars going up and down represent the ranges, which is why they can hit 0. They don't represent standard errors. But for those most common species, which are like bombus and patiens, you can see that planted hayfields, that black bar in the middle, that's where we found the most of those. But the interesting thing I want to point out is for those other, like the 8% of other stuff that we found that's considered rare, we actually saw more of it in planted urban patches and planted roadsides, which is another really good indicator that you and I actually have the ability to try to support diverse and rare bees, even in the city, which I think is pretty cool. Now, in terms of flowers, if I've got some plant nerds here, which I know I do, this is, we looked a lot at these. I don't have pictures of plants you can plant. You can talk to me after if you want to get a list. But basically, what we have here is you have bumblebee visits and flower abundance. So we're saying how many of a particular flower is there and how often is it visited. So the trend is an upward slope, which means the more abundant a flower is, the more often it was visited. But this stuff that's way above means it was visited more often than would be predicted based on its abundance. That means these are like magnet species for bees. That means even when they're in low abundance, bees are all over these things. And they're really, really important plants for bees. So this is a huge list. You could take a snapshot of this, but it's not super specific, but I'm okay with that. But you have things in here like milkweeds. Point of caution, there are even things on here that are exotic or invasive in the state, which is a whole nother interesting story to talk about, because on roadsides and other really screwed up habitats that are disturbed, exotic plants actually represent and provide really important nectar and pollen resources to pollinators. So instead of just always saying, oh man, invasive species are always bad, some invasive flowers are really, really important to bees. A couple that I'll specifically point out is like Monarda fistulosa. That's called bee balm, and it lives up to the name. So if you want to know more about that, just talk to me later. So good flowers do matter, and we know that that can make a difference. And then for bumblebees, because they can travel so far, and in case you didn't know, another cool fact. So the next time you're at a party, you can say, did you know bumblebees can fly several miles in a single foraging bout? They can. They're so big they can travel really far from the nest. So nearby forests is also really important. And I know you all can do something about that because you own, acres of property. So yeah, grow a forest. Here's what I want to focus on as kind of an end note. I couldn't give you a really clear answer. Are we in a pollinator crisis? Some bees, like the rusty patch bumblebee, are experiencing extreme declines at a rapid rate. We can't find it in our state. Other things are unaffected or they're thriving and they're growing in numbers. It's a complicated question that needs to be looked at a more focused, like individual basis or smaller groups of bees. But there are things we can do to try to help the ones that we see declining. It's really easy to build bee homes. Google this or order them from Amazon. So if you think about it, I want you to think about bees need 2 things. They need flowers. We always think about flowers, but we usually forget about the nest sites that they need. And because I showed you there are 500 species in Ohio, most of those live alone. They're single females that build a nest in like the twigs of an old dying plant, or they bury and they tunnel underground in the soil, or they find an old rodent home and build a nest. So they need bee nests, and that's something that you could easily put up outside of your house. I have one. My kids and I love to look at it. We currently have 5 tenants, and we're excited for them. And you can plant flowers. And the whole idea, if you're thinking, I don't know what to plant or where, talk to me and I'll show you a book. Also, you just want to think about stuff that's flowering all year long. So you want your garden to be diverse, and that's what you want in your yard anyway. You want stuff flowering in the spring, in the middle of the summer, and the late summer. So you want a variety of colors, shapes, and you want stuff flowering all the time. and I can talk to you about that. If you are really interested in plants, get 100 Plants to Feed the Bees. It's a really cool book put out by the Xerces Society. This will even tell you, oh, this is a low shade plant, or this thing needs that. So you can really tailor something to your yard, and it shows you where they're native to. Other books, if you're just interested, in bumblebees in particular, A Sting in the Tail is one of my favorites. It's written, it's just a really fun read by Dave Goulson, who I would say is one of the foremost bumblebee experts in the world out of the UK. He lives in England. The Bees in Your Backyard is just a really cool diversity book with lots of awesome pictures. And then Buzz by Thor Hansen. He lives up in the Pacific Northwest. It's really, really good. Also, if you want to help us look for the Rusty Patch Bumblebee, or you just want to start paying attention to bees in general, you can go to inaturalist.org and you can participate in providing information for this Ohio Bee Atlas. This means maybe you're walking in a metro park in the evening and you see a bee on a flower, snap a picture, upload it to iNaturalist, and somebody else will ID it for you, and that data is being used. So my advisor gives a really cool talk about the thousands of data points that they've gained through the Ohio Bee Atlas and what that data can be used, and you can help because you're out there, you've got eyes, and if you see something that looks really interesting, take a picture of it and upload it, and you can help. There's a lot of people that participated in this, and that's my colleague's contact information up there. She was the lead on this project. If you're interested in this in particular, you can email her. But I appreciate it. There's still a lot we can do to try to help the bees, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen. I'll take any questions.